Two killers inspired more fear than any others. One was plague, the other fire. Both killed swiftly and in huge numbers. In the space of little over a year, London was hit by both. Those who fell ill could do little more than choose from a reeking cupboard of quack remedies. One treatment for gout called for puppy boiled up with cucumber, rue, and juniper. As late as 1699, the Royal Society was still debating the health benefits of cow's piss drank to about a pint. The mighty had no better options than the lowly. Many times they were worse off because they were more likely to face a doctor's attentions. When Charles II suffered a stroke in 1685, the royal physicians drained the king of 2 cups of his own blood. Next they administered an enema, a purgative, and a dose of sneezing powder. They drained another cup of blood, still to no effect. They rubbed an ointment of pigeon dung and powdered pearls onto the royal feet. They seared the king's shaved skull and bare feet with red-hot irons. Nothing helped, and the king fell into convulsions. Doctors prepared a potion whose principal ingredient was 40 drops of extract of human skull. After 4 days, Charles died. The first symptoms of the plague could be as innocuous as a sneeze. The custom of saying God bless you when someone sneezes dates from this era. Fever and vomiting came close behind. Next came the surest of signs, in the words of one pamphlet from England's epidemic of 1625. An onslaught of blisters on the skin and swellings beneath it. Blue or purplish spots about the size of a penny appeared first. Shortly after, angry red sores flared up, as if one did burn a hole with a hot iron. Then followed the dreaded black swellings that marked the end. They bulged out from the neck, armpits, or groin, sometimes no bigger than a nutmeg, but some as big as a man's fist. Victims oozed blood from the tender lumps and moaned in pain. Many houses where plague had struck were nailed shut, with those inside left to die or not as fate decreed. Some slum tenements held half a dozen captive families. The houses of the condemned carried a large cross marked on chalk in red. Throughout the summer of 1665, the death toll rose from a few hundred a week in June to 1,000 a week in July, and then to 6,000 a week by the end of August. London witnessed scenes that jarred even hardened witnesses. Some of the infected ran into the streets while others lie half dead and comatose, but never to be waked up by the last trumpet. Some lie vomiting as if they had drunk poison, and others fell dead in the market. At first, when the death rate was still low, doctors had dared hope that the damage would stay in bounds. All such hope was soon dashed. Hodges tells of priests in perfect health who were went to comfort dying men and died alongside them. Doctors at the bedside keeled over next to their patients. Pepys heard about a now commonplace disaster that had befallen an acquaintance. Poor Will that used to sell us ale. His wife and 3 children died, all in a day, I think. In the summer of 1665, the authorities called for the immediate killing of all cats and dogs. Orders went out to Londoners to kill all their dogs of what sort or kind before Thursday next at your farthest. Thousands upon thousands of cats and dogs were killed. The result was to send the population of rats soaring. Throughout the summer, panicky crowds bent on escaping the contaminated city clogged the roads out of London. The poor stayed put. They had no money for travel. The frenzied pack fighting through the narrow streets reminded one eyewitness of a terrified crowd in a burning theater. Some fled toward the Thames and tried to commandeer fishing boats, anything that could float and take them to safety. Those who managed to escape the city had to brave the muskets of the residents of the countryside who greeted the refugees with clubs and guns. By now, with so many dead and so many gone, frenzy had given way to desolation. Grass grew in the streets of London. In place of the usual clamor of voices, street vendors had been banned, so newsboys and rat catchers and fish sellers no longer hawked their wares. Silence reigned. At night, death carts rattled along empty streets in search of bodies, the darkness penetrated only by flickering yellow torchlights. Cries of "Bring out your dead" echoed mournfully. But with death striking willy-nilly, there were too few men left to drive the carts, too few priests to pray over the victims, too few laborers to dig the graves. The carts gave way to mass burial pits and spilled in their cargo. By the end of November 1665, people began to flock back to London. Within another month, the epidemic had all but ended. The plague had claimed 1/5 of the city's population, a total of 100,000 lives. The fire began in the early hours of Sunday, September 2, 1666, in one of London's countless bake shops. Thomas Fariner owned a bakery on Pudding Lane, deep in one of the mazes that made up London's crowded slums. He had a contract to supply ship's biscuits to the sailors fighting the Dutch. On Saturday night, Fariner raked the coals in his ovens and went to bed. He woke to flames and smoke, his staircase afire. Someone woke the Lord Mayor and told him that a blaze had started up near London Bridge. He made his way to the scene reluctantly and cast a disdainful eye on the puny flames. "Psh," he said, "a woman might piss it out." At that point, perhaps, the damage might have been confined, but a gust of wind carried sparks and flame beyond Pudding Lane to the Star Inn on Fish Street Hill, where a pile of straw and hay in the courtyard caught fire. Everything conspired to create a disaster. For nearly a year, London had been suffering through a drought. The wooden city was dry and poised to explode in flames like kindling ready for the match. Tools to fight the blaze were almost non-existent, and the warren of tiny, twisting streets made access for would-be firefighters nearly impossible in any case. Pumps to throw water on the flames were clumsy, weak contraptions, if they could be located in the first place, and if someone managed to connect them to a source of water. Instead, firefighters formed lines and passed along buckets filled at the Thames. The contents of a leather bucket flung into an inferno vanished in a hiss and sizzle like drops of water on a hot skillet. Making matters harder still, London was not just built of wood, but built in the most dangerous way possible. Rickety, slapdash buildings leaned against one another like drunks clutching each other for support. On and on they twisted an endless labyrinth of shops, tenements, and taverns with barely a gap to slow the flames. Even on the opposite sides of an alleyway, gables tottered so near together that anyone could reach out and grab the hand of someone across the alley. And since this was a city of warehouses and shops, it was a city booby-trapped with heaps of coal, vats of oil, stacks of timber and cloth, all poised to stoke the flames. The only real way to fight the fire was to demolish the intact buildings in its path, in the hope of starving it of fuel. As the fire roared, the king himself pitched in to help with the demolition work. standing ankle deep in mud and water, tearing all the walls with spade in hand. Slung over his shoulder was a pouch filled with gold guineas, prizes for the men working with him. Propelled by strong winds, the fire roared along, then split in two. One stream of flames headed into the heart of the city, the other towards the Thames and the warehouses that lined it. The river-bound fire leaped onto London Bridge, in those days covered with shops and tall wooden houses. At the water's edge, the flames reached heights of 50 feet. Panicky refugees stumbled through the mud and begged boatmen to carry them away. On the fire's second night, Pepys watched in shock from a barge on the Thames, smoke stinging his eyes, showers of sparks threatening to set his clothes afire. As he watched, the flames grew. People screamed in terror as they fled, blinded by smoke and ashes. House beams cracked like gunfire when they burned through. Hunks of roof smashed to the ground with great percussive thuds. Stones from church walls exploded as if they had been flung into a furnace. Through the next day, things grew worse. God grant mine eyes may never behold the like, who now saw above 10,000 houses all in flame, wrote the diarist John Evelyn. The noise and cracking and thunder of the impetuous flames, the shrieking of women and children, the hurry of people, the fall of towers, houses, and churches was like a hideous storm, near 2 miles in length and 1 in breadth. Thus I left it, burning, of resemblance of Sodom, or the last day. After 4 days, the wind finally weakened. For the first time, the demolition crews who had resorted to blowing up houses with gunpowder managed to corral the flames. As the fires burned down, Londoners surveyed the remnants of their city. Acre after acre was unrecognizable, the houses gone, and even the patterns of roads and streets obliterated. People wandered in search of their homes, John Evelyn wrote, like men in some dismal desert. One Londoner hurried to St. Paul's Cathedral, long one of the city's landmarks, but now only rubble. The ground was so hot as to almost scorch my toes, William Tazwell wrote. The church walls had collapsed, and the bells and the metal areas of the roof had splashed onto the ground in molten puddles. Tazwell loaded his pockets with scraps of bell metal as souvenirs. Tazwell was not the only visitor to St. Paul's. With their own homes destroyed, many Londoners had sought refuge in the huge, seemingly permanent cathedral. They found little but smoldering rocks. In desperate need for shelter, the refugees crawled inside the underground crypts and took their place alongside the dead.